My name is Ayaka, and I am a consultant with LSAT Unplugged. I'm here every week on Wednesdays to talk about admissions, anything admissions related, and usually we'll do some essay reviewing and all of that. Today, so I apologize. Last week, I got my booster shot and quite literally died. So I wasn't here last week, but this week we're going to talk about diversity statements. Good to see some familiar faces. Good to see some new faces here. So feel free to hop in with any questions in the chat or come off mute and feel free to ask. I'm going to do a kind of an overview of how to look at diversity statements today. But we can definitely go into some very specific questions if you have any. Let me share my screen. Here we are. All right, so nothing really revolutionary here. Some visual aids. But again, today we're talking about diversity statements. Some schools have them, some schools don't. Sometimes schools will kind of mesh it into their the personal statement. So you may find it in different formats. Sometimes the diversity statement is optional, sometimes it's not optional. So really look at the requirements of the school. If the school offers an opportunity to write a diversity statement, I personally say take that opportunity to share more about yourself and kind of talk more about your experiences and what you bring to the table in terms of being a student. So very clearly, the majority of the time when schools are talking about diversity, they're talking about perspective. What kind of perspective are you bringing? How will you add to the incoming class? So many times the prompt will be, what kind of, your diversity statement, the usual prompt, and they will include race, gender, religion, any sort of that basic diversity. On top of that, they will open it up most of the time to experiences that you may have. So anything that a job, a life-changing experience, any of that can bring a different kind of perspective for you to be part of that student body. So I don't think, a lot of times, for example, Asian Americans, they're like, oh, are you really underrepresented? Well, maybe in terms of an Asian American experience, yes. Maybe like overrepresented, but you can spread that out to include, a job that may be a little bit more niche, or, a life experience that not many people have experienced. So there's a different twist that you can add to diversity here. So I just want people to be aware of that. And I think almost everyone can write a diversity statement if they wish to. So when we talk about experiences and perspectives, I kind of look at things in a hierarchy of like how you want to talk about something. And the top of the hierarchy is something that you've actually experienced yourself, right? That is going to be the most potent type of quote unquote experience that's going to be very productive for you to write about. There is, there's a group of people who will, say, oh, I've read this somewhere and I really believe it. And you've been working to kind of achieve what you've read. For example, like you've read about Black Lives Matter and you decided to take action. So I think that reading piece in the middle, that can be a good place to start, but we want to really talk about stuff that's in that experience, at top of the triangle here. Also hearing about things like I've heard my grandfather talk about X, Y, and Z. And so, or like I've heard these talks and I think that I'm a, a diverse thinker or something like that. That could be interesting. It's a really hard essay to write. We really want to tap into the more potent experiential items in this pyramid. So think about a little bit more immediate experience, what you have done, what happened to you, what actions you took, right? Those are kind of the things that we want to tap into, especially when we want to write about a perspective. We don't want to broaden it out. So it's kind of like, oh, I read this here and I tried this here, and, kind of a mishmash of experiences. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a very specific, narrow, tailored perspective. And then our experiences, I think, in general, divide into two categories. One is circumstance, something that we can't help. Childhood stuff, a lot of times we can't help any of that. And then choices that we've made. And they can inform each other, but largely, I think they're in the two categories. So, and either one can tap into a diversity statement. Doesn't mean you have to have one or the other, or you have to have both to write a good diversity statement. There are very well written diversity statements that, solely focus on circumstances, right? Grew up poor, grew up in a rough neighborhood, a truly underrepresented minority, had a severe medical condition. Those are all circumstances, right? And then choices is something like an interesting job you've had, or maybe, you took 6 months to, work in the Peace Corps or something like that. Like, those are choices that we've made in our lives that might give you a different perspective from others. And so can be a different, a point of diversity. So those are the two that usually come up, and usually categorize diversity statements into those two. So just to give you a little bit more concrete examples here, circumstances usually talk about race, age, gender, sexual orientation, your family, economic circumstance, all of that. Choices, you can really talk about, volunteer opportunities, jobs, extracurriculars, if you did something interesting in college, let's say, sports. A lot of times people forget about sports, especially if you were on like varsity teams in college, or you were like a competitive athletics in college. That's actually really interesting. So that's something that you should talk about. And maybe some mistakes that you've made in your life. This is not time to kind of ask for forgiveness in your essay, but you can talk about, oh, maybe you've made a certain mistake that ended in certain consequences, and you can kind of talk about that in a positive way. So, all of those things are valid topics for you to write about in your diversity statement. So if I did this for myself, so for example, in terms of circumstances, I identify as Japanese American. Traditions is really important. There's some Shinto beliefs, Buddhist beliefs. My family's really mixed there. Relationship to food, high expectations for jobs. I'm a female in the workplace. I'm also in tech right now, so that's an interesting combo. I'm 28 years old. I have 2 parents, 1 sister. I lived in San Francisco. I don't live there now, but I did live in San Francisco, and I don't identify with any religion, right? Those are the circumstances that I live in. I could really write about any one of those, but I tend to not want to write about that, just because I personally just feel like that's not where the essence of who I am is in. So if you feel like, oh, actually the stats of who I am, you don't feel like is a point of diversity, maybe you can look at the choices that you've made in that. And so if you look at the choices, for example, I'm in consulting. That it's like the concept of being a day ahead of your clients. It's an interesting mindset to be in. There's also knowing tech. I was in cybersecurity. I was an executive assistant. I did compliance and legal in a foreign company. I was a fitness instructor. I lived abroad for a little bit of time. I love to ski. I love to travel. You know, all of these things are choices that I've made in my life. And I could talk to a little bit more about all of these things and kind of say, hey, this is a perspective I've gained in doing one of these things, right? Don't try to cover all of them. Pick one that's been very impactful for you and write your essay around that. And I think that could be a little bit more of a robust essay if you feel like maybe your stats are not your diversity points. So I hope that was helpful.
I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Ayaka?
Yes, Ayaka. And tell me how to pronounce your name.
It's Taniqua, but everyone calls me T.
T. Okay.
Okay. So I've never heard it as such, and I think this is like perfect. I wish I'd known this before.
Yeah.
So my question is, so when you say like pick one of the choices and then you can choose which perspective, I mean, like when you say the perspective, which like how should it be presented in the essay?
Sure.
As far as like perspective, like say if I took for example, say if I took fitness instructor.
Yeah.
Is it your perspective concerning law? Is it your perspective concerning life in general? Like what exactly would catch their attention?
Sure. And I think you should, I love the question. And, you know, for example, with the fitness instructor, I did that in college. And for me, that was a personal journey of like, I originally was like a super shy person. Like I could not stand in front of people and speak. And when I was training to be the fitness instructor, like my mentor was like, there's nothing that's going to be embarrassing now because you have to dance in front of people and you have to tell them how to do it. So it's that build in confidence. And that's my perspective that I've gained on myself, right? Like I can overcome kind of my own doubts about myself and say, hey, I can actually work through it. And that's something that has given me confidence to work through. And in parallel, say, therefore, I know that I can work through law school. It is something that I want to do. And I want to do that. Right. So does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's basically using it as like a storyline.
Yes.
To present like why I should be why I'm a good candidate for the school type of thing. Okay, I got you. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great question. Yeah, and I think, you know, any one of the choices you can really pull into a diversity statement. So you know, and I've seen it all over the place with the topics that people choose. So, you know, if you're like, I don't know if this is going to fit into a diversity statement, you know, we can talk it out here, or you can, you know, send a message and we can brainstorm. But really, almost anything can turn into a diversity statement.
Okay, perfect. Because like my mind, I'm thinking like, oh, how I love sour burgers. I don't know if you all know what that is, but it's this candy. Oh, and I'll even think something as simple as that, which I would have used, but like I'm just thinking, trying to get my thoughts together. Like, how can I create a well concise diversity statement that the reader isn't like, what the heck is she talking about?
Sure. I mean, I think about, you know, skiing. Like I love to ski. And somebody was like, well, how do you put that into a diversity statement? And I was like, well, okay, when you start at the top of the mountain, you have to kind of track where you're going. You have to say like, okay, here's where I'm going to turn left and then try to like jump down there and then, you know, turn right here and kind of miss those trees over there. And so it's a matter of trying to figure out your route to get to the bottom of the hill. And that's a problem solving skill, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of put it in that metaphor of saying like, hey, I'm a really good problem solver. Because I ski, I can kind of see where the goal is and say, oh, okay, even though it looks like I'm going away from the goal, I know how to get back. And it's a necessary route, right? So like stuff like that can really help you. And that's a perspective that you have, right? And Kareen, I see that you have travel in the comments. That's amazing. Like traveling to 26 countries, that's a lot of exposure that you've had. So I think that would be a great perspective to bring in. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so that's really kind of my spiel on diversity statements. I know it was really fast, but you know, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah. Do we feel like we can write a diversity statement? Because I think everyone can. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. How do you approach talking about culture? Okay, great question. So I think culture is one of those that feels easy, but it's actually a really hard diversity statement topic. I like that follow-up question of how it impacts your perspective or how you grew up. Okay, so culture, because culture means so much, you're gonna have to narrow down what you mean by culture. For example, if I was talking about my own culture, which is Japanese American, I would have to narrow that down. So if I told you, hey, I'm Japanese American, that would mean almost nothing to a stranger, because it's like, okay, what does that mean? You're Asian and American, right? Like it doesn't give you too much to work off of. So I would probably say, for me, the thing that I want to hone in on in Japanese American, being Japanese American, is tradition. I love tradition, but also I've seen through the 28 years that I've lived how tradition is important. I used to say like, hey, like, you know, screw tradition. It's kind of like this annoying thing, but there's a lot of thought behind tradition and, you know, the, you know, traditional dances or poems or cultural items that come up and how I identify in those. So I think, you know, kind of take a very narrow approach in talking about diversity and kind of define that at the very beginning. So say, you know, if I were to write about that in my diversity statement, I would say like, I am Japanese American, and you know, tradition is extremely important to me, right? You want to define that second part, because a lot of times what you'll see in diversity statements that talk about culture is that they'll say, I am X, Y, and Z. And I think it cuts yourself short because you don't know what that actually means. You are the one who lives that experience. I haven't lived that experience. So when you tell me I am X, Y, and Z, I actually don't know what you're talking about. So I think it's important to define that and then talk about, you know, if, for example, if we're talking about tradition, you know, maybe the points where tradition was important to you, were important to me during my life. And when did that switch happen between, you know, not kind of caring for it and then saying, actually there's a purpose to it, and what made me realize that. So that could be a good point for a diversity statement. Does it answer your question, Eva? Great. Okay. And then green. So any other floating questions out there? And Kareen, I know you just directly messaged me. If you are comfortable, do you want to write out your ideas here? I know you said you couldn't come off mute, but okay, yeah, why don't you write it out and we can, I think when we write essays, a lot of times we're all in our minds and we kind of get stuck in our minds. So if you can kind of write it out and tell us what you're thinking about writing, and maybe we can kind of brainstorm together what your thoughts are, and what might be a good direction for you. And I'm happy to do this with anyone else. So if anyone else wants to go through their topics that they might have in mind, feel free to come off mute.
Yeah, I was just wondering after Corinne goes, if I could, it's just my personal statement. I'm not sure the schools that I'm applying to, or thinking of applying to, they really haven't even put in the opportunity to write a diversity statement. So mostly just a personal statement. I know I've gone over it with you a couple times, but I have a little bit more changes. And if we had time, maybe I could run that by you.
Yeah, so in January, we'll do like a whole series of like every week, we'll look at essays. So if you don't mind, let's hold off until next week, because next week is already January, which is crazy. Yeah, and Eva, you as well, I know you just direct message me. Feel free to send it in to admissions@outsideunplugged.com, and we'll read essays every week. So we can, anyone in this class, feel free to send in a draft and we'll take a look. Corinne, want to go into human rights, international law. It's about my experience living through the Beirut explosion and efforts on building a nonprofit to give back to low-income communities. I've had the opportunity to work with Syrian refugees in Lebanon, so I was going to talk about that. Okay, great. Wow, that's a lot, and that's an amazing experience. So I guess my question to you is this all that you want to put into a diversity statement? Is there part of this that's in your personal statement? Served as first Muslim student body president of my university. Obviously that comes with a whole bunch of stories to tell. So being a female power at the time. Okay, great. Let me think. It's 1, 2, I think that's about 4, maybe even 5 stories that you have there. And the unfortunate part of personal statements and diversity statements is you can't cover everything. Diversity statements usually have like a 1-page limit. So I think the unfortunate piece of that is that you're going to need to cut some of that, because it is really, there's a lot going on in each of the stories, I think. So, I think you can break that up into your personal statement, diversity statement. If there's optional essays, use some of that to talk about all of these. And I think the way to choose, I'm like, I don't want you to cut any of these stories. But I think the way to choose would be to ask yourself.
I don't want her to cut any of it either.
I know, right? You're all I'm like, you can't cut any of it. But I think the way to go would be to think to yourself, what can you, it's like one of those where it's like, if you don't know the story, you don't know me, right? I've talked to a lot of admissions officers and they're like, hey, the personal statement, we want to get to know you, right? Who are you? What makes you tick? What makes you get up in the morning? And so I think, there's always those stories that are like, I have to tell the story or else you don't know who I am. And that's kind of a good way to go. The other way to look at it is like, what do you want admissions to know about you, right? What do you want them to, what do you want to leave with them? So that may be a good question to ask. I can't prioritize any of these stories because I'm like, these are all good. But maybe think of it in that way. I can see that second comment that you made about being the student body president for your university. That would be a powerful diversity statement, to be honest. I hope that helped. But yeah, I think I would break those two up. Yeah. I mean, you probably wrote half a page here already, and so that's going to be hard to put in 1 page, 1 to 2 pages. Yeah. Okay, so in your personal statement, you're talking about the explosions and the efforts. Okay. Yeah, and I would love to see that essay if you're up to it in January. And, we might not get to all of them in the first couple weeks, but all through January, we'll do essay readings. Yeah, I think having that focus on leadership and your diversity is actually like a hidden topic where it's like, okay, this is my like diversity, but also it shows that I have leadership skills, right? Like that's kind of a really cool way to go about diversity. And it's kind of this second element that I think would be really good for you. Could potential topic be about importance of language and tradition within culture and how that informs my perspective to life and law? Meaning and tradition is very important to my life, to my family. Primarily do that by speaking our language, listening to music in the language or watching shows in it. Is at risk, and that risk made me have an appreciation for learning about languages, how language is important in other areas of life. I think that's a beautiful sentiment, Eva. And I think you would have to think about how to structure that essay to make sure that it doesn't get redundant. Because I can see it going a little long and a little bit redundant. But I think there's a beautiful way to put it. And I do love the idea of like language influencing thought. And I think, there's always, you speak a second language and maybe even a third, fourth, but there's always like non-translatable words and non-translatable concepts. And so you could really say like, your perspective is broader because you are immersed in this language and this culture, right? Because you're not just confined to the English language, you also have this perspective of the Armenian language, right? And I think it's a really interesting factor that you talk about where the language is at risk. And so you have more appreciation for it and you want to keep that tradition alive. And I think that's a really good perspective there. But I think, Eva, for you, I think you should actually just kind of write it out first. I know it sounds messy right now and it might be messy in your head, but if you can just write out a draft, then we can go in and kind of trim up some of the things that may be redundant or kind of like messy and kind of figure out what needs to be pulled out and kind of clean it up that way. Usually with these messy topics, it's actually easier to just write it out and then fix it later rather than try to write a good draft in the beginning. Yeah, absolutely. And Corinne, I love that point that you have a letter of rec talking about your leadership. I think that's a really good point. And we've done a class on letters of rec before, but you want them to write with purpose. But it's also a good perspective for you to write about as well. Cool. I love the participation in the chat. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't even know where to start. I'm reading everyone's. I'm thinking like what to even put. I don't even know.
Are you drawn to anything? Like, are you like, oh, this is kind of something that I want to talk about? Or
I don't know. I really don't know. Like, I guess it's taking that concept. It's like there's so many concepts I can, like there's so many choices that I've made that I can come up with something. Sure. But I don't know which one, I don't know if I would find myself as in what you said to Eva.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess like I mean, I don't want to board a class. I can give like a
No,
few
please.
things. So a few of the choices. Okay, so here, was in the gang life, did an extra year and a half of high school, just was acting crazy.
Sure.
From there, I have 3 degrees. I created 2 community programs. Of course,
Mhm.
I'm Black, as you know. I'm a Christian. I've been a youth developing youth for 15 years. I started a watch line. Got my master's in theology. I don't know
Mhm.
where to start. I work for the local government.
Yeah.
I don't know like which, I love the jet ski. You want to go things like that. I love the jet ski. I love watches.
Yeah.
I definitely love, to travel. But I don't know what concepts to really like pull from. That would be like,
Sure.
this is it.
If I can give you maybe a little bit of a different perspective here, and it's funny because we're talking about diversity statements, but I think there are definitely people out there who have such an immense life work, right, of starting in their youth and then have done many things across their career, and this is probably not the law school, maybe just the next step, right? So in that case, you might be in a situation where you're writing a diversity statement that spans across multiple experiences. And I think there's an elegant way to do it, and then there's kind of like a resume way to do it, and then the resume way to do it is kind of not fun, and it's not interesting because you're also sending in a resume. I think the one, if you can find, and this is one where it's kind of perspective is 2020, like hindsight. But for example, you could say like, I'm a goal setter, like I can set my own goals and achieve them. Mm-hmm. And that's your point of diversity, right? Like there's a lot of people who are out there who need someone to set their goals for them, and that's how they move forward. But you can actually say, okay, I need to change this in my life to get to the next step. And once you get there, you're not like, okay, I'm done. You're looking for the next thing and the next thing. And so in that trajectory, law school is the next thing, right? You can frame it in that way. I don't want to confuse you too much and say, like that's the way to go, but that could be a way to talk about your experience.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, even the 2 minutes that you talked about all the topics that you have on hand, clearly you have a potent range of experiences that you can talk about, and that's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's sad that we can't put everything in our essays.
Right.
Like, why is there a page limit? I want to write more.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if anyone, writes a draft in the next few weeks, feel free to bring it into class and we'll take a look. All right.
I'm going to hold you to that too.
Yes. Bring it in. All right. Any other questions out there? All right. Well, I will give you guys some time back. Thank you for joining the last week of December. Those of you who are taking the January LSAT, good luck on studying. And I will see you next week. Have a good one.
All right. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.